It's early this Tuesday morning, the 11th of September, 2001.
For years now, politicians, the media, intel agencies in this country and abroad have all demanded that you believe the official story about 9/11. And here's what it is. They tell you a group of al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists, many of whom were known to U.S. intel services, somehow managed to evade capture for years as they planned the most significant and elaborate terror attack in human history. We're told that despite repeated encounters with the FBI, the CIA, local law enforcement, airport security, foreign intel organizations, the right information somehow never made it to the right people. The government failed because it just didn't have the intelligence it needed. That's the story. That story is a lie.
What most people don't do is get in the weeds and look at the evidence, the documented, sourced, and supported by the testimony of CIA officers, FBI agents, congressional investigators, and the families of the victims themselves. That evidence. The question has never been whether the government failed. The question is how they failed. Or did they look the other way? Or even worse, were they complicit? Today, we might find out. Let's start before the attacks, before the planes hit, before any fires. Let's start in a suburb of Langley, Virginia, inside a secret CIA unit called Alex Station, the agency's dedicated bin Laden tracking unit. In the year 1999, inside that unit, embedded as a FBI liaison, is a man named Mark Rossini. At the end of 1999, the CIA and the NSA listened to a phone line out of Sana'a, Yemen that served as the de facto communications hub for al-Qaeda, and they learned something critical. A man named Khalid al-Mindar was traveling from Yemen to Dubai and then on to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, to attend what would later be confirmed as the operational summit of al-Qaeda affiliated. And this wasn't a rumor. The CIA and the NSA had the flight information. They had the passport number. They knew which seat he was sitting on. When Mindar passed through Dubai, the CIA arranged for his hotel room to be searched. And his passport, right there, undeniable. It was valid, multi-entry visa to the United States of America, issued from the American consulate in Saudi Arabia. A man traveling to an al-Qaeda planning summit already had a U.S. visa, and according to court filings, those visas weren't issued by accident. They were issued by direct quote from recent released documents to facilitate an operation run by the Saudis and the CIA. The station chief in Riyadh at the time, a man named John Brennan, who you might know as the future director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Isn't that interesting, Adam? The fact that we have the former, Isn't that interesting, Adam? You have a future CIA director being the guy that gave the passport to a future hijacker. And those kinds of situations turn up a lot where you see I wouldn't even say failing upwards, but when these guys, meaning CIA embedded people, namely someone like a George H.W. Herbert Walker, the original George Bush president, he was a CIA guy. A lot of people implicate him into different operations, especially related to the JFK assassination, and think that moved him on up. And other people got moved up as they were people that successfully got rid of the guy that was trying to cripple the agency. And now, in more modern times, we have a future CIA director being the same person that gives a future hijacker to a plane for, an oopsie-daisy terrorist day known as 9/11. It's pretty fun, right? It's fun to find out these kinds of things.
I love when the dots connect like this. It's great.
Back at Alex Station, the intelligence from Malaysia arrives on computer screens of Mark Rossini and his FBI colleague, Doug Miller. They read it. They understand immediately what it means. A known al-Qaeda associate with a U.S. visa is headed to a terrorist summit. The FBI needs to know this information. Doug sits down and drafts what's called a Central Intelligence Report, a formal document to share the information with the Bureau. Rossini approves it. It goes to the desk of a CIA analyst named Michael Ann Casey. When Rossini pushes Casey on it, she tells him this isn't an FBI matter. The CIA is handling it. And only when the CIA decides to tell the FBI, they will. Until then, Rossini is ordered to say nothing. In his own words, he said, quote, "I believe her, and I have to live with that every day of my life," end quote. The report was killed. The FBI was kept in the dark, and Khalid al-Mindar, along with the second future hijacker, Nawaf al-Hazmi, flew onward to Los Angeles, California. They landed in America, and nobody told anyone. So why would the CIA hide the fact that 2 known al-Qaeda operatives had just entered the United States? According to former White House counterterrorism coordinator Richard Clarke, who gave this account to government investigators, the CIA was running a false flag operation. The goal? Recruit the hijackers as intelligence assets, get someone inside of al-Qaeda. When Cofer Black became head of the CIA's counterterrorism center, he was, in Clarke's words, desperate for sources inside al-Qaeda, and his solution was to try to flip the very people the FBI was supposed to be watching. Clarke went on record with this claim, and the former CIA director George Tenet, when someone gave him a reach around afterwards, his spokesperson denied it categorically. But the official 9/11 Commission report, all 577 pages of it, does not mention the recruitment operation at all, not even once. Why not? Possibly because, as later it emerged, the CIA's director of operations kept the operative involved in recruitment attempts, referred to only as VVV in documents, completely away from the congressional investigation. If you don't interview the witness, you don't find the evidence. And if you don't find the evidence, you can write whatever conclusions you like. The 2 hijackers earlier mentioned, Mindar and Hazmi, arrived in Los Angeles in January 2000. They were on no watch lists, accessible to domestic law enforcement at least. No one was waiting for them. And rather than adopt fake names, move to safe houses, and go in the dark, they did the opposite. They moved to San Diego, they lived openly, they enrolled in flight school, and Hazmi's name, his address, his phone number were all listed in the San Diego phone book. The man that would help murder nearly 3,000 people was listed in the local phone directory under his real name, even though he was a known al-Qaeda affiliate before entering the United States. Shortly after arriving in Los Angeles, the 2 hijackers were contacted by a man named Omar al-Bayoumi. They had an apparently chance encounter at a restaurant near Los Angeles, a meeting that declassified documents suggest was anything but random. As information emerged, Bayoumi, turns out, would be a Saudi intelligence operative with a no-show job at a Saudi government aviation contractor in San Diego. Company employees later said he was one of roughly 50 ghost employees who collected paychecks but never reported to work. According to the 9/11 Commission investigator, he was also receiving substantial sums of money from the Saudi embassy in Washington, funneled through accounts at Riggs Bank along to Hafai bin Faisal, the wife of the Saudi ambassador to the United States. Fun connections there. And what did Bayoumi do with the hijackers? Well, he helped them find an apartment in San Diego, co-signed on a lease for them, paid the first month's rent. He got them bank accounts, driver's license. He even introduced them to local radical figures, including a now infamous cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki. When British law enforcement later raided Bayoumi's home in the UK, they found a notebook which contained a drawing of an airplane, mathematical calculations relating to flying it. The 9/11 Commission investigators never saw this notebook. The CIA's official position, as expressed through their handling of the story, was that the Saudis were being used as a proxy, a workaround. Because the CIA was legally prohibited from domestic intelligence operations, they allegedly used Saudi intelligence as a cutout, relying on Bayoumi to monitor the hijackers while maintaining plausible deniability. Rossini's interpretation is a lot blunter, and he says, as I quote, "We use the Saudis to spy for us and to gather intelligence. If things went wrong, we could push a narrative that would blame the Saudi government, which is exactly what they did," end quote. So it even gets stranger. For a period of time when they were in San Diego, al-Hazmi and al-Mindar actually lived in the home of an FBI informant, a man named Abdul Sattar. The FBI later claimed that they had no idea that their own source was housing the 2 men, who by that point the CIA had flagged as al-Qaeda operatives. Let that sink in. The hijackers were living with an FBI informant. The FBI didn't know, even though they did know, because of the talks that we just had about Alex Station. The CIA did, but then they didn't tell the FBI. If the CIA's recruitment gamble was the root cause of all this intelligence failures, what happened next was a cascading event of failures. Warning after warning, signal after signal, and at every turn, someone at the top of the chain of command didn't read it, didn't act on it, and actively told their subordinates to stop talking about it. On August 6, 2001, 5 weeks before the attacks, President George W. Bush received his daily intelligence briefing. The title of that briefing, verbatim, quote, "Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S." End quote. It wasn't some vague threat assessment. It mentioned Al-Qaeda members residing in the United States. It mentioned support structures in the country. It included this line: FBI information indicates patterns of suspicious activity in this country consistent with preparations for hijackings. CIA Director George Tenet would later say that in the summer of 2001, the system was blinking red. That same guy we talked about that just kind of swept some shit under the rug already, but he even admits that. That's not a metaphor. It was a constant escalating drumbeat of specific intelligence. In May 2001, a report concluded that the FAA issued a circular warning to airlines that there's a heightened risk of hijackings. In July 2001, another report came out that the FAA was actively telling airlines that terror groups were known to plan, train for hijackings, and they were able to conceal explosives in luggage. On June 25th, Richard Clarke told Condoleezza Rice that 6 separate intelligence reports pointed to an imminent Al-Qaeda attack. 3 days later, he told her directly that something very, 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 very big was about to happen. And then, July 12, 2001, Attorney General John Ashcroft was briefed on the CIA warnings. His response, documented, was telling the FBI director, Thomas Pickard, quote, "I don't want you to ever talk to me about Al-Qaeda or these threats. I don't want to hear about Al-Qaeda anymore," end quote. He also denied Pickard's subsequent requests for additional counterterrorism funding. The United States was attacked the very next day. In July 2001, an FBI field agent in Phoenix sent a memo to FBI headquarters suggesting a coordinated effort by Osama bin Laden to place individuals in the United States for aviation training. He recommended a nationwide review of flight schools. The memo never made it to headquarters. Why? In part because as late as 2003, the FBI still did not have a functional internal email system. What the fuck? Most cases were not digitized. Most cases were not digitized at the time. Employees did not have internet access, and by September 2001, the Bureau's computers were so outdated, it took 12 separate commands to save a document. When the FBI needed to distribute photos of the subsequent hijackers after the attack, they sent them through express mail. They didn't even have scanners. Meanwhile, in Minnesota, just weeks before the attacks, FBI agents arrested a French-Moroccan man named Zacharias Moussaoui on immigration violations after he raised suspicions at a flight school. Agents wanted to search his laptop. Permission was denied. Whatever was on that laptop remained unseen until after the towers fell. Okay, one more thing worth noting between 1999 and 2001 is NORAD, the agency responsible for defending North American airspace. They had a training exercise that specifically simulated foreign hijackers getting an airliner and being flown into a building in the United States. They had wargamed this exact scenario. And on the morning of September 11th, the National Reconnaissance Office, which operates spy satellites and surveillance planes, had planned an exercise in which an errant aircraft would crash into one of its buildings. That exercise was scheduled for September 11th, 2001. And it was planned to occur just a few miles from the Dulles Airport, just south of D.C., the very airport from which American Airlines Flight 77 departed before it hit the Pentagon. They had already imagined it. They had practiced it. They had been warned about it repeatedly, and yet somehow, on the day it actually happened, the system failed. That's weird. It's a lot of coincidences. The 9/11 National Commission was established in November 2002. Dick Cheney had already tried to kill any investigation, calling Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle to warn the administration's people would be too busy fighting the war on terror to bother testifying. The implicit message was, call off the inquiry or we'll accuse you of obstructing a war effort. Congress pressed forward anyways. Then the NSA handed them a gift, or rather forced the issue. On June 19th, 2002, a joint congressional inquiry discovered that the NSA had intercepted 2 messages from Al-Qaeda operatives the day before the attacks, saying, quote, the match begins tomorrow, end quote, and, quote, tomorrow is 0 hour, end quote. Someone leaked those messages to CNN. In retaliation, the Bush administration, through the FBI director, Robert Mueller, launched what amounted to be an intimidation campaign against the Congressional Committee. Polygraphs, interrogations, legal threats. Kristen Breitweiser, one of the so-called Jersey girls who had pushed the hardest for an investigation, described it simply as, quote, it had a very chilling effect on the progress of the inquiry, end quote. When Bush finally signed the bill to creating the independent 9/11 Commission, he made sure it had already been neutered. Congress gave it a week subpoena power, a strict 18-month timeline, and a budget of exactly $3 million to start. For context, Congress had allocated $40 million to investigate the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. It allocated $13 million for the Monica Lewinsky investigation where Bill Clinton got blown underneath a desk, and $11 million for a Russiagate probe for Robert Mueller. So the worst terror attack in American history got $3 million. It later was upped to, I believe, $18 million. They gave it another $15 million. But to give it that paltry $3 million just goes to show their enthusiasm for such an investigation. Bush's first choice for the chair of the commission was, get this, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, alleged war criminal, and at the time, the operator of a private consulting firm called Kissinger Associates. When 4 9/11 widows met with Kissinger in his Park Avenue office and asked him directly whether he had any Saudi royal clients or anyone in the bin Laden family, he became visibly flustered, knocked over his coffee, and resigned the following day. Bush's top political advisor, Karl Rove, then personally called former New Jersey Governor Tom Keene to offer him a chairmanship at the commission. When Keene accepted and was taken to the White House, senior advisors told him to their face, quote, we don't want a runaway commission, end quote. The most consequential appointment, however, was the man selected to be the commission's executive director, the person who actually ran the day-to-day operations of the commission. His name was Philip Zelikow. The commission's press release described Zelikow as a distinguished historian and public servant. What it didn't mention was Zelikow had served on Bush's White House Intelligence Advisory Panel. He had helped Condoleezza Rice manage her national security transition. He had co-authored a book with Rice in 1995. In 2002, at Rice's direction, he had authored a policy paper championing preemptive invasions, a paper that helped lay the intellectual groundwork for the invasion of Iraq. Also, notably absent from the press conference, Zelikow was the Bush administration's advisor who had personally made the decision to demote Richard Clarke, the aforementioned White House counterterrorism chief, in the months before 9/11. He was running an investigation into a failure he had helped engineer. Zelikow's first move as executive director was to write the entire report before the investigation even began. In March 2003, with the hearings not yet underway, Zelikow had already drafted a detailed outline complete with chapter headings, subheadings, and all that good stuff, kept it secret from his own staff, and as it turns out, that outline was essentially verbatim to what the final report would be published as. His second move was to cut his own staff off from the commissioners. In a now public memo, Zelikow instructed, if you are contacted by a commissioner with questions, contact him first. He divided the staff into siloed teams. He restricted document access, and he directly supervised Team 3, the group responsible for all classified material from the CIA and the White House. He also entered a secret agreement with the Justice Department to block his investigators from accessing congressional inquiry files until the White House had reviewed them first. When Team 3 submitted their counterterrorism chapter, Zelikow inserted sentences attempting to link al-Qaeda to Iraq. Sentences that had nothing to do with 9/11 and the attacks, and everything to do with laying the political groundwork for the invasion. Staffers caught it, raised the alarms, and those sentences were eventually removed. But Zelikow still stacked the public hearings with discredited neoconservatives who testified about Iraq's supposed connections to al-Qaeda. Connections that were, in the words of the commissioner's own report, not real. Phone logs kept by Zelikow's assistant showed that he regularly received calls from both Condoleezza Rice and Karl Rove throughout the investigation. Zelikow acknowledges that receiving multiple calls from Rove, but claims that he didn't discuss the commission. He maybe talked about the game or something. He declined to say what they discussed instead. The commission's final report contains 61 separate instances of the phrase, quote, found no evidence, end quote. The cute explanation for this, as one investigator put it, is this simple. If you don't look for evidence, you don't find the evidence. And if you don't find the evidence, you can honestly say you found none. The commission's own chair, Tom Keene, later admitted publicly that it had been set up to fail. Now, here's where it gets fun. We always remember Towers 1 and 2, but not much is usually said about Tower 7. There's all the talk about was it a missile that hit the Pentagon? Doesn't look like a plane crash in Pennsylvania, right? But Building 7 wasn't hit, but somehow went up in flames. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 2 buildings in the World Trade Center complex were destroyed by commercial aircraft. You know their names. You've seen the footage thousands of times. That's buildings 1 and 2, as I just said. The third building would also collapse that day. Its name was World Trade Center Building 7. It was a 47-story steel frame skyscraper located roughly a football field away from the North Tower. No airplane hit it. It was damaged by falling debris and caught fire. And at 5:20 in the afternoon, 7 hours after the other towers fell, it collapsed completely. The 9/11 Commission report is 577 pages long. Building 7 is not mentioned once. So let's look at what was in Building 7, right? Why would it collapse? Why is that important? What would that have to do with anything? Well, Building 7's tenant list, to put it diplomatically, is interesting. The building housed the New York City's Office of Emergency Management, the agency whose entire job was responsible for coordinating to events like 9/11. Its records were destroyed when the building fell. On the 9th and 10th floor housed the New York field office of the Secret Service. Its records also destroyed. 25th floor was home to a CIA field office, the largest CIA presence outside of Langley, Virginia, its headquarters. Also destroyed. Across the same floor, a Department of Defense office, exact purpose unclear, but also destroyed. The SEC's office in the building was overseeing a number of major active fraud investigations at the time of the collapse. Those files went with the building, and likely so did the investigations. Maybe we look into what those investigations were in another video. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, investigated the collapse and issued a report in 2008. Their conclusion: falling debris from the North Tower damaged water mains, disabled Building 7's sprinkler systems, fires burned unchecked for hours. Eventually, thermal expansion of steel beams caused a critical girder designated 2001A to walk off its seat at column 79. That triggered what NIST calls a progressive collapse, a cascading structural failure that brought the building down. Now, there are 2 obvious problems with that explanation. First, every available video of the collapse shows Building 7 coming down symmetrically, like all at once, in what more closely resembles what engineers would call a global collapse, right? Is where all load-bearing columns fail simultaneously. Then a progressive collapse starting with a single failure point and moving its way progressively, right? Second, no steel frame building in the history has ever collapsed due to fire alone, right? Not the 38-story One Meridian Plaza in Philadelphia, which burned for 18 hours in 1991. Not the 62-story First Interstate Bank in Los Angeles, which had a massive multi-floor fire in 1988. Not the 24-story Grenfell Tower in London, which burned for over 24 hours in 2017, though it's worth noting Grenfell was reinforced with concrete framing rather than just pure steel structure, making the One Meridian and First Interstate Bank the stronger comparisons. None of them collapsed, by the way. Building 7 burned for 7 hours and then fell under 12 seconds. This brings me to the University of Alaska study. In 2020, Professor Leroy Hulsey of the University of Alaska Fairbanks published the results of a 4-year independent engineering study funded by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. His finding: office fires of the type burning in Building 7 on September 11th could not have produced sufficient enough thermal expansion to cause the critical girder failure described in the NIST report. It was, as he concluded, physically impossible. More significantly, his team found that NIST's explanation simply does not account for what anyone can see in the video, a total simultaneous collapse and not a progressive one. His conclusion, only controlled demolition could have produced the collapse pattern observed in the videos at Tower 7. It's worth acknowledging that the study was funded by an advocacy organization, which critics cite as a potential conflict of interest. NIST, for its part, did investigate the blast scenarios and concluded that they were unlikely, citing the difficulty of placing charges undetected and absence of window-breaking patterns consistent with explosives. NIST also noted that thermite, a chemical compound cited by some researchers, burns slowly and would require enormous quantities to weaken structural steel. However, it is worth noting NIST never tested the debris for thermite residue. A separate study published by Open Chemical Physics Journal in 2009 analyzed the dust samples collected from Lower Manhattan in the hours after the collapse, reporting finding red-gray chips containing what researchers described as highly energetic thermitic material. NIST's response was that they could not rule out the presence of such compounds, but maintained that their fire collapse explanation was still the true story. What NIST could not explain was the eyewitness testimonies, such as Barry Jennings, a New York City Housing Authority official who was inside Building 7 before it collapsed and repeatedly reported hearing explosions inside the building. Explosions before either tower had been hit and before they had fallen. Jennings died in 2008 and at the age of 53, just 2 days before the NIST report that was released on Building 7. The cause of his death is still a mystery. Family members were reported privately, but it was not publicly disclosed. On the afternoon of September 11th, the BBC broadcast a live news report announcing that Building 7, which they identified as a major tenant for Salomon Brothers, had collapsed. The building was clearly visible, still standing in the background of the shot, and that report was broadcasted 20 minutes before the building actually fell. Was this simply rushed, chaotic reporting in the middle of an unprecedented crisis? Possibly, but the question of how news organizations came to report the collapse of a building before it happened has never been satisfactorily answered. And the rubble that might have resolved these questions was shipped overseas before a thorough investigation could be conducted. According to the New York Times, an unknown number of steel columns from the World Trade Center were sent to mills as far away as Asia without ever being examined or saved. The limited analysis that was done took place at a scrapyard in Jersey City. Engineers who wanted to study the most important structural failure in American history were working from samples collected by volunteers. 3 days before the attacks, the volume of put options placed against United Airlines was notably elevated. On September 10th, the put options against American Airlines were 285 times the normal volume. In the same period, put options against Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch surged, both which had major offices in the World Trade Center buildings. Gold and oil call options also spiked in the days before the attacks. Put options against British Airways on September 7th were also 4 times the normal level. A put option, for those unfamiliar, is a financial instrument that profits when a stock price falls, and a call option basically does the opposite. Massive volumes for put options against airlines and financial institutions placed days before an attack would devastate both sectors. Raises an obvious question, though. Who, besides Al-Qaeda, knew about the attacks that were coming? The 9/11 Commission report does address this. It's buried in a footnote on page 499. The report notes that 95% of the trade against United Airlines was made by a single U.S.-based institutional investor. It calls it innocuous. It does not name the investor. The United States government knows who it is. They decline to tell publicly. No explanation is given why. Independent financial researchers who since reviewed the trading data, and they say, in their words, it was massive. The FBI investigated and concluded the trades were unrelated to foreknowledge of the attacks. The methodology behind the conclusion was never made public. But, okay. Then there's the matter of who owned the buildings when they came down. For decades, the World Trade Center complex was owned and operated by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. In early 2001, it was put up for a long-term lease. The initial bid, $3.25 billion. And it was won by a company called Vernado Realty Trust. That deal collapsed. The Port Authority's chairman at the time, Louis Eisenberg, a former Goldman Sachs partner and longtime leader of the Republican Jewish Coalition, then gave Silverstein Properties a 14-day window to renegotiate. On July 24th, 2001, exactly 49 days before September 11th, developer Larry Silverstein finalized a 99-year lease on the complex for $3.22 billion. He put just $14 million of his own equity down to do this. Almost immediately, Silverstein took out a multi-layered insurance policy providing roughly $3.5 billion in coverage per an occurrence of, and crucially, the policy specifically covered acts of terrorism, including aircraft strikes. The towers then came down. Silverstein argued that the two planes constituted two separate occurrences under the policy, entitling him to a double payout. Two jury trials produced split results. The final settlement was $4.55 billion. On a $14 million personal investment, that's a return of approximately 325 to 1 in under a year. Pretty good deal. Silverstein was not in his office that morning of September 11th. He had, by his own account, a dermatologist appointment. His son and daughter, who both worked in Silverstein Properties and regularly attended morning meetings in the building, were both also running late that day and had not arrived when the first plane hit. They both survived. They all survived. Silverstein was later reported by Haaretz to have spoken by phone with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu every Sunday. He was also close friends with Ehud Barak and Ariel Sharon. There's also the matter of what Silverstein said about Building 7. In a 2002 PBS documentary, he described a conversation he claims to have had with the fire department commander on the day of the attacks, in which he said, quote, "I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've made the decision to pull it."
Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
The word pull is standard terminology in the controlled demolition industry. Silverstein's representatives later claimed that he was referring to pulling firefighters out of the building, not demolishing it. But make of that of what you will. One day before September 11th, Zim American Israeli Shipping Company, a subsidiary 49% owned by the Israeli government, vacated its office on the 16th floor of the North Tower. The company had announced the relocation in April 2001 and paid a $50,000 penalty to break its lease early so it could complete the move ahead of schedule. It relocated its American headquarters to Norfolk, Virginia. Zim has never publicly explained why it accelerated the move or why it chose to absorb the financial penalty to vacate the building early. Let's talk about the Pentagon. On September 10th, 2001, just days before the attacks, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld held a press conference and made a startling announcement. The Pentagon could not account for approximately $2.3 trillion in transactions. The man responsible for overseeing Pentagon finances at the moment was Dov Zakheim, who had been confirmed as the comptroller and CFO of the Department of Defense in May 2001. Before taking that government role, he had served as the CEO of S.Y. Coleman, a subsidiary of Systems Planning Corporation. SPC manufactured what it called a flight termination system, a technology capable of remotely taking control of multiple aircraft simultaneously and navigating them from a central location. The announcement of the $2.3 trillion unaccounted for by the Pentagon was buried the next morning as the planes hit the towers. The investigation into where the money had gone was disrupted when the section of the Pentagon struck by Flight 77 turned out to be the one housing the offices of the financial analysts working on exactly that problem. Most of them were killed. So a separate financial thread, one that receives less mainstream attention but can't be entirely dismissed, concerns a set of securities tied to some researchers that have called Project Hammer. On September 1991, it is alleged that covert financial operations have been established to help destabilize the post-Soviet Russian economy, essentially looting the collapsed USSR through market mechanisms. The securities were involved in 10-year instruments. They matured in September 2001. The relevance to 9/11 is that several offices, most directly targeted on September 11th, were the offices involved in tracking, clearing, or investigating large-scale financial transactions. Cantor Fitzgerald, the largest U.S. government security dealer, occupied floors directly struck by the first plane. Eurobrokers was in the South Tower, an El Dorado task force, an interagency money laundering watchdog group coordinating major financial crime investigation was located in World Trade Center Building 6, which was damaged by an explosion before either tower fell. The SEC's investigative files were also, as we said, in Building 7. More to note on Cantor Fitzgerald, that's a company that's now headed up with Howard Lutnick's sons, but was headed up with by Howard Lutnick, the guy that just nearly missed being killed himself, and is now the Commerce Secretary of the United States and a part of the cabinet of this current administration. He also is notably a former neighbor to Jeffrey Epstein. Oddly enough, he had Unit 9, or it was the street address was 9, and next door to him was Epstein at address number 11. So that's also fun. Let's get back into it. On September 14th, 2001, the Securities and Exchange Commission invoked emergency powers to temporarily ease regulatory restrictions on clearing and settling securities trades. This was the first time in U.S. history the SEC had done so under that particular provision. So I want to make this clear. The claim that 9/11 was engineered specifically to clear fraudulent securities is unverified and contested. But the concentration of financial regulators, investigators, and market infrastructure in the specific buildings that were attacked and the regulatory response in the days that follow are facts. What conclusions that you draw from them is a matter of ongoing debate and what information you tend to look at. I'm not trying to say that you should have your own. I'm not telling you what to think. Make your own conclusions. The failures of the U.S. intelligence before 9/11 were documented, extensive, and in our view, partially deliberate. But the U.S. government wasn't the only one that had prior knowledge of the attacks. As early as January 2001, France's Foreign Intelligence Service had learned that Al-Qaeda was planning a hijacking operation involving a U.S. airline. What the French told the United States and when has never been fully made public. Former CIA officer Michael Schuler, who ran Alex Station, has stated directly that both Israeli and British intelligence had better information on bin Laden and Al-Qaeda than the CIA did. Part of the reason for this, he suggested, was that the NSA regularly shared raw intelligence signals with foreign governments, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, and that it withheld from its own CIA counterparts those exact signals. When Schuer's team asked for the NSA's raw intercept data, they were told the NSA did not have to share it with anyone under the 1947 legislation that created the agency. The NSA, the largest American intelligence agency by far, has never assigned a dedicated staff researcher The NSA, the largest American intelligence agency by far, has never assigned a dedicated staff researcher by the 9/11 Commission. The commission, according to investigators who worked on it, had members who didn't fully understand what the NSA did. The NSA's terrorism archives have still never been thoroughly reviewed by outside investigators. In December 2001, Fox News correspondent Carl Cameron aired a 4-part investigative series detailed what the U.S. investigators described as extensive Israeli intelligence operations inside of the United States. The series focused on 2 Israeli-linked companies with deep access to American communications infrastructure. The first was Amdocs Limited, a Israeli-based company that was at the time the world's largest telecommunications billing service, handling records for roughly 90% of all U.S. phone calls. This gave the company access to transactional data on essentially every call made in America. Who called whom, when, and for how long. Cameron reported that the NSA had issued a top secret warning in 1999 that the American call records were finding their way into foreign hands, specifically Israel's. The second was Converse Infosys, now known as Verint Systems, a subsidiary of an Israeli-run company that provided wiretapping equipment used by the FBI, the DEA, and other U.S. law enforcement agencies to court-ordered surveillance. Cameron reported that this equipment allegedly contained a backdoor and that Converse maintained a permanent remote maintenance link to wiretapping computers it had sold to the American law enforcement. 50% of Converse's research and development costs were reportedly reimbursed by the Israeli Minister of Industry and Trade. Multiple investigators told Fox News on record that pursuing the Converse thread was, in their words, considered career suicide. Brigadier General Hanan Geffen, former commander of Israel's Unit 8200, the Signals Intelligence Division, later told Forbes that several major Israeli tech companies had been directly influenced by Unit 8200 technology. Converse was among one of these that he named. In May 2000, the FBI had investigated allegations that Israel had penetrated 4 White House telephone lines. The investigation went nowhere. This is relevant to 9/11 in a specific way. Throughout the period the hijackers were being monitored and repeatedly evaded surveillance, the agencies doing nothing were using communication infrastructure with known Israeli backdoors. How the hijackers seemed to stay one step of the U.S. intelligence, moving each time they appeared to come close to detection, has never been fully explained, but it does seem to shed a light to it, knowing that the Israelis knew exactly the information the United States was getting. With that in mind, let's talk about the dancing Israelis. On the morning of September 11th, a group of 5 Israeli nationals were arrested in New Jersey after being observed by multiple witnesses appearing to celebrate as the World Trade Center burned. They had been setting up cameras on top of a van before the attacks began. When arrested, they were found carrying box cutters, multiple passports, thousands of dollars in cash, and photographs of themselves smiling with the towers burning behind them in the background. FBI documents indicate that polygraph examinations of the men suggested that they had not been forewarned of the attacks specifically, but also they were engaged in deception and they were likely involved in illegal foreign counterterrorism activity. In other words, they were certainly spying inside the United States. The leader of the group, Dominic Suter, left for Israel within days of the attacks. He was later added to the FBI anti-terror watch list distributed to European allies in 2002. Most of the group was detained for 2.5 months before being deported for visa violations, the standard procedure for removing foreign intelligence assets from allied nations without a diplomatic incident. A memorandum submitted to the 9/11 Commission presented the evidence suggesting that a network of Israeli nationalists posing as art students had been operating throughout the United States in the year before the attacks, and that their operating areas substantially overlapped with the locations where the future hijackers were living and training. This was further corroborated by a 61-page internal DEA report from June 2001, 3 months before the attacks, documenting approximately 130 incidents of Israeli nationals, many with military intelligence backgrounds, systemically attempting to gain access to federal facilities across the country. The Commission's response to this body of evidence was in keeping in its general approach to not address it. So that's fun as well. As for the Saudi angle, documents related to Saudi involvement in 9/11 remain classified for over a decade, hidden in what became known as the 28 pages of the Congressional Inquiry's Joint Report. When those pages were finally released in 2016, they documented Boyami's financial connections to the Saudi embassy, as we stated, and raised serious questions about whether elements of the Saudi government had provided material support for at least 2 of the hijackers. The 9/11 Commission had buried the Saudi material into the footnotes, and the Bush administration had hidden the pages entirely. By 1996, al-Qaeda had declared war on the United States. Osama bin Laden had made no secret of his intentions. He so publicly and in a formal declaration had said so. And the CIA knew where he was. They had the Alex station, a whole dedicated tracking unit, right? And Mike Schur, who ran the ALEC station from 95 to 99, has testified that between 97 and 99, his unit identified at least 10 actionable opportunities to kill or capture bin Laden. Not one of them was authorized. The first serious plan was called Tarnak Farms Operation. The CIA paramilitary teams, working with Afghan tribal contacts, planned to raid bin Laden's compound in Afghanistan. The plan was rehearsed 4 times, including twice in the United States. It received approval from every relevant legal and national security authority. The Attorney General was briefed. The FBI Director was briefed. The U.S. Attorney was briefed. And then, days before the execution, it was called off. The reason given? A child's swing set appeared in surveillance imagery of the compound, and officials were worried about the optics of civilian casualties. Didn't we just bomb a school the other day? It was just like, what? Someone's got to do it. A second operation, a kidnapping plan, required the coordination of tribal leaders and was approved, rehearsed, and then canceled at the last moment. Days later, Al-Qaeda bombed 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa, killing over 200 people. At 4 in the morning, following the bombing, CIA Director Tenet called Schur personally, said, quote, "Can we revive the program?" End quote. The answer was yes, but the pattern was already set. Schur's conclusion was, after 22 years, the intelligence community was taking out bin Laden was achievable since 97. Instead, the pattern repeated itself again and again. An operation would come together, authorization was granted, and then someone near the top of the chain of command would get cold feet and call it off. Meanwhile, as the CIA's bin Laden unit was being blocked from getting basic intelligence on bin Laden himself, including financial reports and health information, the man running the CIA's station in Riyadh, John Brennan, according to Schur, when the ALEC station sent cable after cable to Riyadh requesting Brennan's cooperation in getting information from Saudi intelligence contacts, Brennan escalated it directly to CIA Director Tenet. The cables were stopped. The information was never provided. The USS Cole was bombed in October 2000. 17 American sailors died. The U.S. government knew The USS Cole was bombed in October 2000. 17 American sailors died. The U.S. government knew immediately that Al-Qaeda was responsible. Clinton did not respond militarily. When the Bush administration inherited the situation, Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz described the Cole bombing as stale. He wanted something bigger. He would get it. On September 11th, 2001, the following people lost: 2,977 civilians who were murdered, the children who discovered their parents weren't coming home, the firefighters and police officers who ran into the towers and were killed or died in the years later following the toxic air they breathed in. Nearly 7,000 U.S. service members were killed in the wars that followed, and 52,000 wounded. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghanis, many of which were civilians, who died in the chaos that was called for response for these attacks. Entire countries that were destabilized, in global order that might never recover. And then there's the winners. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, the CIA received a budget supplement described by those who worked there at the time as a 10-figure sum. The exact amount remains classified. Covert Black, the head of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, told a colleague who came to him with an operational proposal, says, quote, "Whatever it is, just do it. I have so much money, I can't possibly spend it all," end quote. By 2015, the CIA's public budget had risen to $15 billion, 500% higher than what it was in the mid-90s. Much of the budget remains classified and is not included in that figure. The FBI's budget went from $3.3 billion in 2001 to nearly $11 billion by 2023. In exchange for its massive expansion, the FBI radically deprioritized traditional crime fighting, including narcotics enforcement. Over 550 non-supervisory field agents positions were permanently reassigned from drug work. This was followed by the deadliest drug epidemic in American history, in which more than 1 million Americans died from the opiate epidemic. As the former CIA officer John Kirikow put it, before 9/11, Silicon Valley had the highest concentration of millionaires in America. After 9/11, it became Washington, D.C. The reason is simple. Congress poured billions into counterterrorism and intelligence contracting, and everybody in the right zip codes got rich. Now, what expanded along with the budgets was the CIA's operational mandate. The agency transformed itself, in Kirakow's words, from an intelligence service that recruited spies to steal secrets into a paramilitary organization whose job was to capture and kill anyone who posed a threat to the United States. The torture program, officially called Enhanced Interrogation Techniques, was approved in a chain that ran from two outside psychologists named James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, through the CIA's General Counsel, through the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, and through the National Security Council, and ultimately through the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and President Bush himself. The techniques approved included waterboarding, sleep deprivation, by chaining naked prisoners to the ceiling of chilled cells while industrial lights and death metal played for days at a time. Walling off and repeatedly slamming the prisoner's head against a concrete wall with enough force to cause permanent traumatic brain injuries. And there's the cold cells, stripping prisoners naked, chaining them, standing for 24 hours, and throwing buckets of ice on them every hour. Good old ice bucket challenge. I wonder if they got donations. CIA officers have testified that prisoners were murdered using this technique, and in 1946, the United States executed Japanese soldiers for waterboarding American POWs. In 2002, the Justice Department decided that law needs to be changed. At its peak, Guantanamo Bay had 780 detainees, and according to Kirikow, upwards of 80 to 85% of them were innocent people caught in dragnets. Afghan and Pakistani civilians who had been turned in by neighbors, settling personal scores, and then grabbed by U.S. forces and then shipped to Cuba, where they had in Dick Cheney's deliberate legal construction no rights at all. They were not prisoners of war. They weren't considered enemy combatants. They weren't given trials. They weren't given anything. Some of those people still are allegedly remain in those cells. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged 9/11 mastermind, who was subjected to extensive torture, confessed during the interrogation to personally killing Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl. We know that he didn't kill Pearl. Another man confessed to the murder and was convicted and directed Pakistani authorities to Pearl's body. The confession extracted from Mohammed by CIA interrogators was false. What else in the official stories, like the planning story, right, from interrogations, what else in the official story of 9/11's planning came from those interrogations is unknown. The 9/11 Commission's accounts from how the hijackers met, how the plan was derived, and who was involved is drawn almost entirely from interrogations of Mohammed and his associates, Ramzi bin al-Shib. Interrogations conducted through this torture program. Anyone with basic understanding of coercive interrogation knows that information being produced under torture is not reliable. National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, who spent most of the summer of 2001 ignoring escalating intelligence warnings about an imminent al-Qaeda attack, who demoted Richard Clarke, and who had an extensive undisclosed ties to the Commission's executive director, was promoted to Secretary of State in 2005. The Senate confirmed her with overwhelming support. CIA Director George Tenet, who oversaw the agency's recruitment gamble with the hijackers who blocked the FBI from receiving critical intelligence and who later provided the false intelligence used to justify the invasion of Iraq, was awarded with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. He joined the boards of multiple defense contractors and he's spent years at an investment bank. John Brennan, the Riyadh station chief who helped the hijackers obtain the U.S. visas, who blocked the Alex station from obtaining basic intelligence on bin Laden, who later orchestrated the prosecution of the CIA whistleblower John Kirikow for the crime of telling the truth, was appointed director of the CIA by Barack Obama, While running the agency, he was caught ordering the hacking of Senate Intelligence Committee computers. He lied about it. He faced no consequences. He subsequently became an MSNBC contributor. That's fun too. Philip Zelikow, who wrote the commission's conclusions, maintained secret communications with Karl Rove throughout the investigation, blocked investigators from accessing critical documents, and was rewarded by close friend Condoleezza Rice with a senior position at the State Department, where he served as her deputy. He's now a professor at the University of Virginia. Paul Wolfowitz, who began calling for the invasion of Iraq within hours of the 9/11 attacks, who dismissed the bombings of the USS Cole as stale, who argued against pursuing bin Laden directly because he wanted something bigger. He became president of the World Bank. Fuck. Resigned in 2007 after a corruption scandal. Go figure. In 2016, he endorsed Hillary Clinton. Sick. And then there's the man who blew the whistle, John Kirikow, the CIA officer who told ABC News that the agency was torturing its prisoners and that the policy had been personally approved by the president, was the only person in the entire CIA to go to prison for anything related to 9/11. His crime? Telling the truth. He served 30 months in federal prison, and I'm sure that's all he had to deal with. There's no other issues he had. The 9/11 Commission's final 70 pages are a set of recommended reforms. Those reforms, almost without exception, expand the power of the very agencies that had failed to prevent the attacks. The Patriot Act, signed into law before the commission even issued its report, gave intelligence and law enforcement agencies the ability to access your records with minimal judicial oversight. It authorized wiretaps of multiple phones simultaneously without identifying a specific target. It authorized searches of homes and businesses without notification. It created the National Security Letters, a mechanism for the FBI to obtain personal records without any court approval, accompanied by gag orders prohibiting the disclosure of the information. Fun. In 2007, the NSA created the PRISM program, PRISM, conducting warrantless surveillance of phone calls, emails, and internet activity, much of directed at American citizens who have done nothing wrong. Kristen Breitweiser, a 9/11 widow who is also a lawyer, is direct about this. She says, and I quote, "The attacks 100% should have been prevented. The U.S. government had everything it needed to stop the attacks. We had the hijackers fully identified. We knew exactly where they were. We knew what they were up to. We already had all the information we needed before 9/11, end quote. In other words, the Patriot Act was not a response to a failure of information. It was an expansion of power using a failure that those in power had engineered, or at the very least permitted. The 9/11 Commission recommended creating a new Director of National Intelligence to sit inside the White House, expanding the TSA, and restructuring the entire American security apparatus. Every one of those recommendations increased the footprint of the national security state. None of them have made America demonstrably safer. All of them have permanently transformed the relationship between the American government and the American people. So there's a ton I could have included into these. So there's a ton more we could have included. But for the interest of time and just trying to get the most complete story in the shortest amount of time, this is what I came up with. I will leave my fact-checking notes below that kind of go over all the different stuff that I looked at to come to these conclusions and get this information. Thank you for watching the podcast. Adam was here this whole time, by the way. Go ahead and talk for him, Adam.
I was here and I tricked you.
That's my co-host, boy. Have a good day, and we love you. Stay safe. Bye. Adam?
Bye.
No.